Open your phone right now. A blue dot sits exactly where you are, visible to them at any hour, whether you are at work, at the gym, or asleep in your own bed. Now try to do the same thing to them. There is no dot. There is no share. There is a perfectly reasonable explanation every single time it comes up. Battery died. Forgot to turn it on. Privacy thing. Nothing personal. You are permanently locatable. They are permanently a rumor. And somewhere underneath the completely normal, completely explainable reasons, a much simpler fact is sitting quietly in plain sight. You built your whole life around being findable to them. They built theirs around never quite being found. You almost do not notice it at first, because the explanation always arrives so quickly, so reasonably, that questioning it feels unnecessary. But the pattern is not in any single excuse. It is in how perfectly, how consistently, the excuses always land on the same side. If this kind of clarity helps your nervous system settle, subscribe. PsychBond is a daily decoder for psychology, relationships, and avoidant and anxious attachment patterns, so you stop guessing. Let's be precise about what this pattern actually is, because the instinct to explain it away with logistics is strong, and it deserves to be interrupted early. This is not really about location sharing as a feature. Location is simply the easiest, most measurable example of a much broader pattern. The asymmetry of who gets to be known and who gets to remain unknown. Being findable means being accountable to a version of the truth that exists independent of what someone chooses to tell you. Being unfindable means retaining full control over the story, because if nobody can verify where you actually are, nobody can ever catch the story not matching reality. One person in this dynamic is fully auditable. The other is operating entirely on the honor system, and only one of them agreed to that arrangement out loud. You can watch this exact asymmetry play out in specific, recurring moments if you pay attention. You text asking where they are and receive a vague answer. Out, around, running errands, while they can name your exact location without needing to ask at all. You mention plans a week in advance as a matter of course, while their plans arrive as finished facts, already happened, never previewed. You are the one who says, "Call me if you need anything. I will be at this address until this time," while their address, on any given evening, remains a detail you are simply expected not to need. None of these moments look dramatic in isolation. Each one is small enough to let pass without comment, but tracked together over weeks, they form a very clear, very consistent map of who is required to be known and who has quietly opted out of that requirement entirely. Here is the distinction most people miss when they first notice this pattern. It is not usually about active deception in the dramatic sense many people jump to. Most people caught in this pattern are not managing a secret second life. What they are managing is something quieter and, in its own way, more revealing. A deep discomfort with being fully knowable to another person. Sharing location is a small, mundane act on the surface, but underneath it, it is a statement of total availability. It says, "You may check on me at any time, and I accept that consequence." For someone whose nervous system treats total availability as a threat to their autonomy, this small technical feature becomes surprisingly loaded, not because they are hiding something specific, but because the exposure itself, the simple fact of being trackable, feels like giving up a piece of control they are not willing to give up. This is worth sitting with, because it reframes the entire pattern away from suspicion and toward capacity. The question worth asking is not primarily, what are they hiding? The question worth asking is, what does it mean that this person needs to remain unverifiable in order to feel comfortable, while asking you to be fully verifiable in return? A relationship built on mutual trust does not usually require one person to hold all the transparency and the other to hold none of it. When the transparency only flows in one direction, you are not looking at a difference in preference. You are looking at a structural imbalance in who is required to be accountable and who is not. Let's talk about why this specific asymmetry tends to form, because understanding the mechanism helps you stop taking it as a personal insult while still taking it seriously as information. For a lot of people who maintain this pattern, findability was learned early to be dangerous rather than neutral. Being fully known, fully locatable, fully accounted for may have meant being fully subject to control, criticism, or intrusion in an earlier chapter of their life. A controlling parent, an overly monitored childhood, a past relationship where being tracked was used as a tool of control rather than connection. A nervous system shaped by that history does not experience being findable as safety. It experiences it as exposure to something that has hurt them before. So they keep a permanent, quiet exit available, not necessarily because they plan to use it, but because its mere existence lets them breathe in a way that full visibility never would. It also helps to understand that not everyone who resists being fully findable is protecting the same thing. Some people resist because findability feels like a loss of autonomy specifically, a fear that being located means being obligated, that if you know where they are, you can also make claims on their time. Others resist because findability feels like exposure to judgment, a fear that being seen clearly in the mundane, unglamorous parts of their life invites criticism they would rather avoid entirely. And a smaller number resist because findability threatens an actual double life, a parallel arrangement that genuinely could not survive scrutiny. These three reasons produce the exact same external behavior, but they predict very different futures for the relationship, which is part of why the capacity filter matters more than trying to guess the specific motive from the outside. None of this means the pattern is harmless simply because it has an understandable origin. It means the origin explains the mechanism without excusing the imbalance, and both of those things can be true simultaneously. You can understand exactly why someone developed a need to remain unfindable and still correctly recognize that a relationship where only one person is required to be locatable is not built on equal footing, regardless of how sympathetic the underlying reason is. It is worth being precise about what unfindability actually proves and what it does not, because the instinct to assume the worst case is strong and not always accurate. Someone resisting full visibility does not automatically mean an affair, a double life, or active deception is occurring. It usually means something narrower and, in its own way, more mundane. A nervous system that has decided the cost of being fully known outweighs the benefit of the closeness that comes with it. There is one more layer worth naming: the guilt that can show up simply for noticing this pattern at all. It can feel controlling to want to know where someone is, petty to care about a feature as small as a location pin, easy to talk yourself into believing the double standard is not really a big deal. But the size of a feature is not the size of what it reveals. A single asymmetric setting can expose an entire structural imbalance in who is allowed to remain unaccountable and who is not. You are allowed to take a small inconsistency seriously when what it points to is not small at all. Trust that instinct. It rarely is. Small features rarely stay small once you look closely enough at what they are actually protecting. It is worth remembering, too, that the goal here was never to catch someone in a lie. The goal is simply to see the actual shape of the arrangement clearly enough to decide, with real information, whether it is one you are willing to keep living inside. That distinction matters because it changes the conversation you need to have. You are not necessarily uncovering a secret. You are uncovering a decision, made somewhere below conscious awareness, about how much of themselves this person is willing to risk making visible to another human being. This often traces back further than the current relationship, too. If someone grew up in a household where information was currency, where knowing things about other people meant having power over them, or where being fully known by a parent meant being fully controlled by one, they may have built their entire sense of safety around retaining a private, unverifiable core that nobody else gets access to. That strategy may have genuinely protected them once. The problem is that a strategy built for survival in one environment does not automatically know how to recognize when it has outlived its usefulness in a completely different one. A relationship that was actually built on trust rather than threat. Now let's name the signs of this pattern clearly, one at a time, because vague discomfort is much harder to act on than a named list of what is actually happening. The first sign is asymmetric access without asymmetric explanation. You share your location, your calendar, your day-to-day whereabouts freely and without being asked twice, while requests for the same information from them are met with a reason, a delay, or a change of subject every single time, with no version of the conversation ever landing on yes. The second sign is selective technical trouble. Location sharing that mysteriously fails to work specifically for this one purpose, despite the rest of their phone functioning perfectly, apps updating, notifications arriving, everything else operating exactly as it should, except the one feature that would make them findable. The third sign is information control disguised as forgetfulness. Details about where they were, who they were with, what the evening actually involved arrive vague, incomplete, or delayed. Not because the information is inherently secret, but because volunteering it fully would mean giving up the very unaccountability that feels protective to them. The fourth sign is discomfort with unplanned contact. Notice how they respond to being reached unexpectedly. A call instead of a text, a drop-by instead of a scheduled visit. Genuine ease with spontaneous contact and a subtle irritation or evasiveness at being reached without notice reveal very different relationships to being found. The fifth sign is the double standard around checking in. Notice whether they expect updates from you. Where are you? When will you be back? Who are you with? While treating the same questions directed at them as intrusive, controlling, or unnecessary. A standard that only applies in one direction is not actually a standard. It is a rule written for someone else's behavior, not their own. Once you can see the signs clearly, the next step is applying the capacity filter. Because naming the pattern is not the same as knowing what it actually predicts about the relationship going forward. Can they tolerate being known? This means when they are unexpectedly seen somewhere, recognized, or asked a direct question about their whereabouts, do they respond with simple, unbothered honesty? Or does even harmless visibility produce a flash of defensiveness that seems disproportionate to the moment? Can they offer reciprocity? This means when you raise the imbalance directly, not as an accusation but as an observation, do they move toward matching your transparency, even imperfectly? Or does the conversation consistently end with your access shrinking to match their unavailability, instead of their availability rising to match yours? Can they separate privacy from concealment? This means, are they able to articulate what specifically they want private and why, in a way that makes sense and does not simply dissolve every time it is examined? Or does the justification shift depending on which detail you happen to be asking about that day? Can they stay steady under normal accountability? This means, does ordinary, reasonable checking in destabilize them the way it would destabilize someone hiding something, or can they hold a completely mundane level of shared visibility without treating it as an infringement on their freedom? Can they close the gap over time? This means, has the asymmetry between what you share and what they share narrowed at all across the life of the relationship? Or has it stayed exactly, precisely the same width it was on day one, regardless of how much trust has otherwise been built? If most of these questions come back empty, you are not looking at someone who simply values privacy more than you do. You are looking at a structural arrangement where one person carries the full weight of being accountable, and the other has quietly opted out of that weight entirely, while still expecting to receive it from you. It is worth being fair here, because this topic can easily tip into something harsher than it needs to be. Wanting some baseline of personal privacy is not, on its own, a red flag. Nobody owes anyone else a complete, real-time broadcast of their entire life, and a healthy relationship absolutely allows for some information to simply belong to one person alone. The marker here is not whether someone wants any privacy at all. The marker is whether the privacy is symmetrical, offered and received in roughly equal measure, or whether it flows in one direction only, with one person permanently visible and the other permanently exempt. It is also worth distinguishing a single lapse from a pattern before drawing any conclusions. Everyone occasionally forgets to text back, loses track of time, or has a phone die at an inconvenient moment. The marker here was never a single missed update. It is the consistent, one-directional shape the entire arrangement takes, month after month, regardless of how much goodwill or explanation gets offered along the way. It is also worth distinguishing this pattern from something it sometimes gets confused with, which is a person who is simply private by nature across every relationship in their life, not selectively private with you specifically. Someone who keeps the same boundaries with close friends, family, and partners alike is exhibiting a consistent personality trait, not a targeted asymmetry. The marker of the pattern described here is not general privacy. It is specific, targeted unfindability that exists only in relation to you, paired with an expectation that you remain fully findable in return. It is also worth noticing whether this asymmetry exists only around locations specifically, or whether it shows up in other forms too. Vague answers about spending, unclear accounts of time spent with friends, a general pattern of information arriving incomplete across multiple areas of life at once. If the asymmetry is isolated to one feature, it may simply reflect a specific discomfort. If it shows up everywhere, it is describing something much larger about how much of themselves this person is willing to make visible at all. Let's talk about what this pattern actually costs the person on the receiving end of it, because that cost deserves its own space, instead of being treated as an overreaction to something as small as a location pin. Being the only fully trackable person in a relationship creates a very specific, corrosive kind of hypervigilance over time. You start noticing every small inconsistency, every vague answer, every conveniently timed technical glitch, not because you are paranoid, but because your nervous system is doing exactly what it is designed to do when it is given asymmetric information and told to feel secure anyway. you cannot build genuine safety on a foundation where only one side of the relationship is verifiable. Because safety requires knowing that the story you are being told and the reality underneath it are the same thing. And asymmetric findability makes that impossible to confirm. A relationship can survive one person needing more privacy than the other in a given season. It has a much harder time surviving a permanent, unspoken rule that only one side of the partnership is ever required to be found. There is also a subtler cost worth naming, which is what happens to your own sense of privacy over time. When you are the only fully visible person in the relationship, you may start to feel that your own need for any boundary at all has become suspicious by comparison, since you are constantly being held to a standard of total transparency that was never applied evenly. This can quietly train you to overexplain your own whereabouts, overshare your own plans, and feel guilty for wanting even the small, ordinary privacies that most people are allowed to have, simply because the relationship has trained you to believe that any withheld information is inherently a red flag, a belief that somehow never seems to apply to them. It is worth pausing on what this actually looks like from the inside for the person carrying all the visibility. You may notice yourself over-explaining an ordinary errand, sending an unprompted photo to prove you really are where you said you would be, apologizing for being 5 minutes late, as though lateness itself were a small betrayal. None of these habits developed because you are naturally anxious about your own honesty. They developed because the relationship trained you to treat any gap in information as suspicious, a standard you absorbed entirely on your own, since it was never actually applied to the person who taught it to you. So what does this actually mean, practically, without turning this into a demand for surveillance-level tracking? Because the goal here is not to build a relationship where both people are constantly monitored. It is to build one where both people are equally accountable. The first thing worth doing is naming the asymmetry, plainly and specifically, using the signs listed earlier rather than leading with a vague feeling of unease that is easy to dismiss or argue away. Specific observed patterns are much harder to talk yourself or someone else out of than a general sense that something feels off. The second thing worth doing is asking directly for reciprocity, once, clearly, without over-explaining your reasoning first. Something as simple as noticing the imbalance out loud and asking what it would take for that to even out. Their answer, and specifically their willingness to actually move toward evening it out, rather than simply explaining why it cannot change, is the real information here. There is a meaningful difference worth naming between someone who acknowledges the imbalance once pointed out, even uncomfortably, and someone who defends it as though transparency itself were the unreasonable request. The first response, however imperfect, shows a person capable of examining their own behavior honestly. The second response tells you the asymmetry is not an oversight. It is a position they intend to keep holding, regardless of how clearly it gets named. The third thing worth doing is watching what happens over time, rather than accepting a single explanation as the final word. One instance of technical trouble is an accident. A pattern of technical trouble that only ever affects this one feature, indefinitely, without resolution, is not an accident anymore. It is a structure that has simply been dressed up as one. The fourth thing worth doing has nothing to do with them at all. If you notice yourself sliding into constant, low-level surveillance of your own, refreshing a map, tracking inconsistencies, building a private case file of your own, it helps to name that honestly. This is not paranoia appearing out of nowhere. It is a completely reasonable adaptation to being asked to feel secure inside an arrangement that was never actually built to be secure in the first place. Not because you have become paranoid, but because the arrangement itself was never actually equal to begin with. The fifth thing worth doing is deciding what specific level of reciprocity would actually satisfy you, separate from an all-or-nothing standard of constant tracking. You do not need real-time location access to feel secure. You need the underlying accountability that location sharing merely symbolizes. Decide what that looks like in practical terms. Honest answers to direct questions, consistent follow-through on stated plans, a general willingness to be known in the ordinary details of daily life, and treat their movement toward or away from that standard as the real answer, rather than continuing to privately audit inconsistencies on your own.
You are not asking for too much by wanting a relationship where accountability moves in both directions. Some privacy is normal and healthy. Total, permanent unfindability on one side while you remain permanently locatable on the other is not privacy. It is a structural advantage that only one person in the relationship gets to hold. What you deserve is not constant tracking. It is a partner willing to be just as knowable to you as you already are to them. Somewhere in all of this, it is worth remembering that wanting mutual accountability is not control. It is the basic architecture trust is actually built from. A relationship where only one person can ever be located, questioned, or verified is not a partnership between equals. It is an arrangement where one person carries all the risk of being known while the other keeps a permanent, quiet exit in reserve. If this helped your body feel a little safer, liking or following this, wherever you're listening or watching, helps it reach someone else who needs this clarity. Welcome to PsychBond. You're safe here.